Thank you. So, like Jen, I'm a speech and language therapist, and I'm also, as Sophie said, talking about stammering, but from a rather different kind of perspective, and I think a kind of complementary perspective. A lot of the work I do is looking at how communication disorders impact on people's kind of natural conversations. I just wanted to acknowledge the ESRC here have funded quite a bit of that work. So what I want to do here is say something a little bit about stammering. Jen's already nicely kind of introduced that. So we're talking about stammering or stuttering. It's the same disorder. And that can be defined as disruption in the rhythmic flow of speech, which can be characterized by repetition, sound prolongations, and blocking on sounds. However, there are very few naturalistic studies of people who stammer in spontaneous interaction. So we know a lot about what people who stammer feel about their stammer. We know quite a bit about like brain studies, as Jen was talking about now, but we actually know very, very little about how does stammering actually look when people are actually trying to talk to other people in kind of real life situations. What I'm going to be talking about here is people who stammer on the telephone particularly, and they find that particularly difficult. And I want to quote this paper from 20 years ago, which was saying that what they found was that 63% of people who stammer surveyed experienced talking on the phone as more difficult than having a face-to-face conversation. And there's a nice quote from this I want to use. I'll come back to this at the end because I think this covers a lot of stuff. There's a bit that they don't really cover here that I want to kind of get onto in my talk. So what they say is the combination of the highly defined beginnings of telephone calls, their generally dyadic nature and other specific content, often specific content, anticipation as the telephone rings, and the need to start speaking at the moment the call is answered, contrive to make using the telephone a potentially hazardous task for those with stuttering impairment, and one exacerbated by the fact that should blocking difficulties arise, their interlocutor may be unclear as to what is happening. I'll come back to that issue as well. And one of the things they go on to say in the paper that's not in that quote is that, of course, when you think about it, what talking on the phone for these people does is it removes all the resources of non-verbal communication, and what they're relying on is actually the modality, which is of course their weakest one, which is the vocal modality. And that's the kind of title of my talk, when the voice is all there is. Phone calls are hard because they're only relying on their voice. So the methodology I use is a method called conversation analysis, and I won't go into that in much detail here, but you'll see kind of what it looks like and the way that I kind of try to make claims based on the data. This work always uses recordings of naturally occurring social interactions. I'm going to be showing you some video footage of people who filmed themselves largely in this talk today. And then there's transcriptions of these interactions using a particular method, which again I won't go into very much, but I'll say enough for you to hopefully follow the transcripts. And then in conversation analysis, looking at normal conversation, which is where most of the work has been done, what the researchers particularly look at is what they call the kind of practices used by participants. So the kind of linguistic kind of grammar or vocabulary that's used, which together allow us to produce what they call social actions, like requesting, offering, telling a joke, and so on. So how can we kind of work out what the kind of function is by the linguistic form? And they're particularly interested in what the kind of norms or rules are that govern how we talk. And I'll be kind of using that idea to look at stammering. A lot of these rules, we all follow these rules, but they're largely kind of unconscious to us. We've just been socialized into using them. What I'm interested in is how might these practices differ in what could be called atypical interactions. So people with communication disorders, how are their conversations different systematically to people without communication disorders? And what I want to look at for this talk is some systematic differences in the relationship between what might be called current turn by one speaker, the person who's speaking at any particular time in a conversation, and next turn, the turn by the person who's kind of going to come in next, who's listening but will speak next. And what we know from normal conversation is that there's particular rules around how we do turns in conversation. And one way of kind of thinking about this is that when somebody's speaking, let's call that the current turn, speaker A, they've got certain rights about their turn. And one of those is that when I start speaking and it's my turn at talking, I'm allowed to keep that turn to a place where I could be finished. So what's called a transition relevance place. That's my right. You shouldn't interrupt me while I'm talking, basically. There are certain places where you can, and it's kind of allowed, but they're quite particular. But along with that goes certain responsibilities, and these are going to be really relevant to looking at people who stammer. So first of all, the speaker who's talking should talk until the end. You shouldn't just stop in the middle, because why has he done that? And also, you should display progressivity, so you shouldn't be having gaps. Again, the question becomes what's going on. That's the rule. That's breaking the rule. You're going to see where this goes for people who stammer. They're going to have difficulty with some of these rules. So what I want to do here is talk about a few things about what we can learn about stammering from looking at these kind of naturally occurring conversations. I want to look at how a stammer manifests itself within talk and interaction, in terms of what I'm calling here disrupted term progressivity, the lack of smooth progress towards a possible ending of the term. And then I want to look at the possible interactional consequences of that, particularly this notion that one thing that can happen a lot, if you're somebody who stammers, one thing that can happen to you a lot is the other person will come into your turn and start to speak before you've finished your turn. And I'm going to talk about 3 different ways in which that happens. And then I want to say something about how the person with a stammer might kind of fight back. So if you're a person who stammers and you know that that's happening to you on the phone, what might you do? I want to talk about one way that people do that. And then I want to finish by kind of broadening it a little bit and thinking about how vocal turns at talk are actually in a sense a projection of oneself. Let's pick up on Rob's stuff a little bit about voice and identity, but in a slightly different kind of way. So that's where we're going. So I'm going to just show you lots of clips. So this is, I should say something about the data I'm using. So I almost always work with data that I collect myself or other people collect and I kind of get use of for whatever reason. But this is an unusual data set for me because it all comes from YouTube. And it's all people who stammer who've recorded themselves making phone calls. Now the phone calls are naturally occurring in the sense that they seem to be real phone calls. I could talk about that later, why I think that. And what people have often done, like this woman is, she's video recorded herself making a phone call to like a company. They're all service calls. So they're phoning restaurants or companies, and they're going to ask a question or about opening times or things like this. And what they're often doing in these videos is kind of advocacy thing. They're kind of basically saying, you know, you can do this. You can make the phone call if you're a person who stammers, or here's something I found useful, or things like this. So I won't, until the very end, I won't show you them talking to the camera. I'm just going to show you the phone calls themselves. But you'll see some of the issues that come up for these people who stammer. So here's a thing about the disrupted term progressivity. What you're going to see is this woman here that I'm calling Tabitha. She phones up a restaurant. The guy on the other end said, "This is Martin, can I help you?" She's going to have a stammer during this. But what you're going to see is, even though she's quite disfluent and has markedly disrupted fluency, she gets to the end of her turns and doesn't get interrupted.
This is Martin. Can I help you?
Hi. Do you guys take reservations?
Yes. For when?
For tomorrow night.
Yep, perfect. How many?
So what I want you to see is that she's breaking one of the rules of normal conversation, which is you should stay fluent and progress towards the end of your turn fluently. And we know from normal conversation that one of the consequences for anybody like us who is disfluent, who doesn't have a stammer or some other communication disorder, if you are kind of disfluent and you have like a 1 second silence or something, it's quite common that people will come in and start to talk during your turn, and you might lose your turn. So for somebody who stammers, who's got even more kind of disfluency and longer silences, like this 4.5 seconds is what this number refers to here, that's a really long period of time within a turn. And she actually comments after this call about how facilitative the other person on the other end of the call was to let her go that much. But what I'm going to show you is that this is one way it can play out, that it's more fluent but still normal turn taking. But quite commonly it's not that way. And I want to show you the ways in which the other person can start coming into the person with the stammer's kind of turn space. So this is just a kind of way of showing that. One possible consequence of having this disrupted turn progressivity, as I'm calling it, is that there's incursion into your turn space. I'm going to come back to this term later, but basically, the normal rule is once I start talking, it's my turn space, you can't come in. People with stammers have kind of lost that right to some extent, or people treat them as if they've lost that right. So they keep on kind of losing their turn. Their turn gets, there's incursion into it. So the way of kind of representing this is the person with the stammer is talking, and even before they've reached their transition relevance place, the possible end, speaker B comes in and starts to talk. So there's three main ways this happens in the data set I've been looking at. The first one is turn completion, and this is probably the one that we're most kind of intuitively familiar with. What people will often say when you talk about stammering is something like, oh, if somebody stammers when they're talking to me, I don't know what to do for the best. Should I kind of come in and finish it for them, or should I let them kind of struggle on? And that's just a dilemma that everybody kind of has. But I wanted to show you a couple of examples of what that looks like when somebody comes in and completes the sentence for the person who stammers. This is a young man phoning a doctor's surgery. You see he becomes quite disfluent, and the receptionist is going to come in and finish it for him.
Good morning.
Hi. I would like to book
Appointment, yeah?
Yes.
And then here's another example. This is, I think, somebody who's making a recording of themselves as part of a course or something that they're doing. They're phoning I think maybe like a pizza delivery company or something. Same kind of thing. You can see quite a lot of disfluency, and then the person on the other end will come in and kind of do a kind of guess of what they were trying to, the person with the stammer was trying to say.
Yeah, I'm gonna do for you.
Hi, I was wondering how far you all
How far we delivered?
yes.
It's just kind of more. It's not really a distance thing. It's like a time thing. Well, where are you?
A second way in which the person with the stammer can kind of have their turn come into by another person is when the other person does what's called the other initiation of repair. That is things like pardon, you saw who, or some kind of querying kind of behavior, like you haven't understood the person who's talking. And this is one of the things I didn't know about stammering, is actually it's not just that people get their turn finished, quite often other people don't really understand them very well. So here's an example of this. Again, we've seen this woman before. It's a continuation of the phone call we just saw, phoning up a restaurant.
Yep, perfect. How many?
Just
How many?
just two.
Two. In time.
So what's happened here is Tabitha is trying to say just two. She's and for some reason the person at the other end has kind of lost track of what's going on here. So they kind of query it, they repeat their question, and she has another go at it. I'll give you another way in which this. Oops, sorry. This can actually get a little bit more kind of problematic sometimes. In that one of the things we know about normal conversation is that usually when we're talking and another person doesn't understand us, they wait until the end of our turn and then say pardon. They don't come in during our turn. And one of the problems with this pattern where the other person often comes into the turn of the person who stammers is the person who comes in often inadvertently overlaps the key word that would have solved the problem. So here's an example of that.
It's just kind of more. It's not really a distance thing. It's like a time thing. Well, where are you located at?
The landings.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Landings.
So unfortunate timing, they just come in as she was saying the key word that she then had to repeat. Okay, and then the third way that people can come in, and this is one that's very linked to the nature of phone calls particularly, and it picks up on the quote I gave at the beginning about the recipient often doesn't know what's going on. Do remember in this case the recipients here are just somebody in a restaurant who's picked up a phone and suddenly they're faced with somebody who's, well, they don't know what's going on. So there's this issue of them having to make sense of these phone calls. So one of the things one way this can come up is that the recipient of the call may have to check the availability or presence of the person with the stammer in the phone call. Basically, is there still somebody there? Is the line still working? And so on. So they misinterpret the disfluency for the phone line in some way being problematic, or the person, whatever, not being there for some reason. So here's an example of this. Of course, these things tend to come in specific places within the phone calls. One is quite near the beginning of the call, is a very common place, of course. So here's Tabitha again, different phone call. She's phoning up another restaurant, and you're going to see that she has a stammer, and the restaurant person is going to, again, repeat this hello, basically, is anybody there kind of query.
Hi. Do you guys take reservations?
We do in our dining room.
Okay, here's another example. This time it's towards the end of the phone call. So this woman here, who we're calling Janice, has phoned up a restaurant, and she's asked them what time, it was a cafe, what time they close, and they've said 5 p.m. And then she moves towards the end of the call. So she says, okay, oh, well, that's all, so thank you. Yeah, no problem. And then she says, all right. So at this point, it's really clear that what should happen is she should move into the closing, which is bye-bye. She made the phone call. She's the one who probably start to do the winding up and say bye-bye. But as it turns out, she has a stammer at that point, and you're going to see that the other person seems rather confused about what's going on here, and they come in with this hello again. This is one example I've got actually where you'll see this. I also find this one quite painful for some reason, which is that is one example of the calls. It's a kind of laminated one in the sense that you're seeing the woman talk on the phone, but you're also seeing her kind of address or look towards the camera. And these two things are going to become intermingled in this particular example.
Okay. Well, that's all. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Take care.
Hey, thank you.
Okay, so she's kind of doing this bye-bye. It's kind of like, I'm about to do this bye-bye and finish the call. It's been successful. Of course, she blocks, and then it kind of goes wrong for her. Some of the videos do have like music on them. You'll get another example of this as we go through, like or sometimes text over the top and so on. So I was saying that this seems to be a recurrent problem people with a stammer have. This is why stammering in a way matters in conversation, or one of the ways it matters. It's not just because of the self-esteem issues and you feel bad about yourself and all those kind of things that we know about. Practically, you can lose your turn a lot of the time in various kinds of ways, or people don't know what you're talking about, or they're wondering if you're still there, and so on. Can the person with a stammer do anything to kind of mitigate that and lessen those potential problems? And one of the things that stammerers themselves talk about is something that they call advertising, which is where at the beginning of the phone call, they will announce that they are a person who stammers. And one of the things that this seems to be functioning to do is to say to the other person, either explicitly or implicitly, give me some more time, because I'm not going to be able to talk at the normal pace that you are used to. And basically what it's kind of saying implicitly is, don't come into my turn space. Let me get to the end of my turn, how long it takes. Okay? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this, and then I'll just kind of pull things together. So this is a woman who she's phoning up a store about something, and I just want you to notice the way that she starts her call. So I should just say that, of course, what you'll have seen so far is, and what you'll know from kind of intuition, is that when you make this kind of call to a company or whatever, when they pick up the phone, the kind of two things that are expected first are your greeting as the caller, and then your reason for calling them, okay? And what you're going to see is that she changes those rules to do something else.
Actually, first, let me tell you that I'm a person who stutters, so I'm gonna need you to be a little patient. Hi, I'm calling because I bought.
Okay, so she's kind of changed the rules in two ways. She's basically done it that she's not going to do the greeting first and the reason for call. She launches into something about herself and who she is. And the second way she's trying to change the call is basically saying to the other person, I want you to behave differently to the way you'd almost always naturally behave, and talk in a kind of different way where you give me more time. So she's kind of challenging the social status quo in a way, in a quite major way here, I think, actually. This seems quite a good idea in some ways, but it's not problem-free, as you'll see, and you might kind of be able to work out what kind of problems people can experience when they try to do this. Here's one of them, which is, of course, the thing about that kind of strategy is it involves talk. Talk is the thing that's problematic for the person who stutters. So all the problems I've talked about can occur even with these, hey, listen, I'm a stammerer kind of utterances. And people might still interrupt you, basically, or not work out what you're saying. And one of the reasons why they definitely may not work out what you're saying is because they're not expecting an announcement at that point. They're expecting a greeting and a reason for the phone call. So the recipients can get rather thrown by these announcements at the start of calls. Here's an example.
Hi, I stutter, and so sometimes I stutter, and so it takes time for me to talk sometimes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I was trying to figure out what.
So some of the same problems can occur. Are there any ways around that? Yes, there are. And you see some quite clever strategies by people who stammer. Here's one of them. This is a guy phoning up a company to ask something about, can he get his tickets cheaper in some way or other? Or can he get a refund? Yeah. And just watch the way he brings in the fact that he's a stutterer.
Thanks for calling to General Sales. This is Melanie. How may I assist you?
Hi. I actually was having a lot of trouble with your automated system because I stutter, so it kept misunderstanding me.
Oh, no problem. It misunderstands a lot of people.
Yeah.
What's your account number?
So what we need to notice there is he's done the normal things. He's done the greeting and the reason for the call, but within the reason for the call, he slipped in the fact that he's a stutterer. So that actually works quite well for him. Yeah. So what I've then said is that we're seeing what the recurrent problems are for people who stammer on telephone calls. We've seen a strategy they can do something about it. Can we then kind of broaden this out a little bit? And what I want to do to finish with is to make a link between this notion that if you're a stammerer and somebody comes into your turn, it's not just a matter that somebody's come into your turn. I want to kind of float this idea that, in a sense, it's not just your turn that's been kind of invaded, it's kind of yourself that's been invaded. And one of the things we know about turns at talk is, when I'm talking in a conversation, as I say, there's kind of rights and responsibilities around turns. That turn is me projecting myself. It's my right to say what I want until I get to a possible end of my turn. If you come in and interrupt me, you haven't just taken over my turn, you've kind of been rude to me. So there's a sense in which myself is being kind of socially not treated with the respect it should be. And I want to kind of take that idea and look at the case of people who stammer. So I'm borrowing a notion from the sociologist Irving Goffman, who talks about the territories of the self. Some of these are quite commonsensical, like the space around you is a territory of the self. People aren't allowed to invade, to come within a certain space unless they know you very well and things like this. And I want to kind of talk about the kind of turn at talk as a territory of the self here. So this is one aspect of phone calls for people who stammer that hasn't really been talked about before, like the quote I mentioned at the beginning. So if we think about one's turn at talk as a territory of the self, that is, it's an entity which one has rights to possess and control. You shouldn't come into my space, my turn space. It's my space. Now, recurrent incursions by another person into one's turn are therefore incursions into the territory of the self. And this is all the more an issue when within phone calls for people who stammer, since their vocal turn at talk is all that there is of the speaker's self. They're relying only on voice. And since their vocal turn at talk is recurrently vulnerable because of their disorder, their projected self within the interaction is recurrently vulnerable. This is an ongoing social problem that they have. The self-identification as a stammerer at the start of the call not only provides an opportunity to preserve their turn space from incursion, but also, in this sense, to preserve their self from incursion. And I want to just kind of finish, one more thing about this. So this provides a possible research link between interactional issues, turns at talk, and psychosocial issues, the sense of feeling invaded, feeling worthless, your dignity is not respected. And I just want to finish with showing you an address to camera by one of the people who stammer that we've been looking at, where she finishes the phone call and she turns to the camera and she's going to talk to other people who stammer. And she's going to be saying things like, she's talking here about the fact she announced she was a stammerer at the beginning of the call. And she's talking about the advantages of that as she sees it. And she says, the bit in green here I want to really focus on. And in doing that, I made my own space in this world. And the walls that maybe could have seemed like they were closing in on me, I spread them open. I created a space where I could authentically be who I am and keep the dignity intact. Now, I don't think this woman knows anything about the turn space, but I think she's kind of picking up in a way on space in a slightly different and related sense. It's my space. And by announcing I'm a stammerer, I've created space. That is, people don't come into my turn, they don't come into myself, they let me be who I am with all my differences in the world. So here's her saying this to the camera.
So there we go. No apologies, no asking them to excuse us. I simply told her a simple truth, that I'm a person who stutters. And in doing that, I made my own space in this world, and the walls that maybe could have seemed like they were closing in on me, I spread them open. I created a space where I could authentically be who I am and keep the dignity intact. I simply told her what is going to happen and told her I need her to be patient. No bearing with me, no shame. You and I are not something that needs to be dealt with.
Okay, that's it. Thanks.